Some men spend 40 years building something solid, a career, a pension, a plan for the end. They do everything right. The savings accounts, the financial advisors, the careful budgets, and they reach retirement believing that the hard part is finally over. And then sometimes one woman walks through the door, not to destroy a man, not on purpose. At least, that's what he'll tell himself for a long time. This is the story of a retired civil engineer from Ohio who moved to the mountains of the Philippines with $480,000 in retirement savings, and a woman he believed would be his last great love. He is 72 years old now. He is sitting on a porch in Tagaytay. The house behind him has a foreclosure notice on the door. This is what he wants you to know. I signed the papers on a Tuesday morning. I remember that clearly because it was raining, and the real estate broker, a cheerful young man named Rayner, who wore a tie even in that heat, kept apologizing for the weather like it was his fault. I told him not to worry. I had waited 68 years for a morning like that. A little rain wasn't going to ruin anything. The property was everything I had pictured. A modest house in a retirement village just outside Tagaytay. Concrete walls painted faded yellow, a terracotta roof, a small garden with potted plants along the porch, and a koi pond out back that caught the morning light in a way that made me feel, for the first time in years, that I had made a genuinely good decision. The view of Taal Volcano from the porch was the kind of thing you'd see on a postcard and assume was exaggerated. It wasn't. Some mornings the mist would roll in so thick you could barely see the gate, and I would stand there with my coffee and just breathe. Her name was Floriza. She was 44 years old, a licensed caregiver with 8 years of experience working in elder care facilities in Cebu and Davao. I had found her through a placement agency that specialized in pairing foreign retirees with Filipino caregiving staff. I wasn't looking for a companion. I want to be honest about that. I was 70. My left hip had started giving me serious trouble after a replacement that hadn't healed quite right, and I had a mild cardiac condition that required daily monitoring. I needed help, practical professional help, a caregiver. That's all I told myself I needed. Floriza arrived on a Thursday. She wore a blue uniform top and carried a small overnight bag because the arrangement included a live-in component during the week. She was quiet that first day, professional. She checked my medication schedule, organized the kitchen, prepared a simple meal, and asked clear, sensible questions about my routine. I went to bed that night thinking I had made a smart hire. I felt relieved. What I did not expect was the conversation that happened 2 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon when the rain kept us both inside, and she made hot arroz caldo, and we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and she told me about her daughter. Her name was Blessy. She was 12 years old, and she lived with Floriza's mother in Cebu. Floriza sent money home every month, had been doing it for years. She hadn't seen Blessy in 7 months because the travel was expensive, and she couldn't afford to lose work time. She told me this simply, without asking for anything, just telling me, the way people do when they've been carrying something heavy, and they finally find a table where it feels safe enough to set it down for a moment. I told her I understood. I had a daughter too, Patricia. She lived in Columbus with her husband and 2 kids, and we spoke every few weeks. It was civil, correct, but not warm. We had lost something between us years ago, some softness, and neither of us had found a way to get it back. I missed her. I missed who we used to be to each other. That's part of why I had come here. I couldn't stand the careful politeness of it anymore. The holidays where everyone pretended everything was fine. I needed air. Floriza looked at me across that table with a kind of quiet understanding that I hadn't experienced in a very long time, and I felt something open in my chest. Not romantic, just human. The simple recognition of 2 people who had each lost something and were still, somehow, trying to keep going. That was the beginning. Over the next few months, the nature of our relationship shifted in ways I didn't fully track while they were happening. She still performed her professional duties impeccably. My medications were managed, my appointments kept, my blood pressure logged twice daily. But she also started cooking meals she knew I enjoyed, not just what was nutritionally recommended. She laughed at my jokes, even the bad ones. She walked with me in the garden on the evenings when my hip permitted it, and she would take my arm on the uneven parts of the path without being asked, just knowing. I started looking forward to those walks in a way I had not looked forward to much of anything in years. By the 4th month, I had stopped thinking of her as my caregiver. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it's easy to present yourself as a victim when you're sitting where I'm sitting now. But the truth is I knew. Not everything, not the full picture. But I knew there was a risk in what I was feeling, and I chose to walk into it anyway. Because I was lonely and she was kind, and I had convinced myself that a man my age, in my condition, with my limitations, was entitled to whatever warmth he could find. I told her how I felt on a quiet evening in October. We were sitting on the porch watching the mist come in over the volcano. I was careful. I told her I didn't want to make her uncomfortable, that I understood the professional dynamics, that there was no obligation. She was quiet for a long time. Then she reached over and took my hand. "I know this is complicated," she said, "but I don't feel the way about you that I'm supposed to feel about a client. I haven't for a long time." I believed her. I still don't know completely whether I should have. That's the question I'll be asking myself for the rest of my life. The first shift happened so gradually that I nearly missed it entirely. In November, about a month after we had acknowledged what we were to each other, Floriza mentioned that her mother was having trouble with the electricity bill in Cebu. The amount she said was small, the equivalent of about $120. I gave it to her without a second thought. A week later, Blessie's school was asking for a contribution toward a new classroom building. Another $200. I said yes. I want to be clear. These amounts were not a burden to me at the time. I had $480 in a combination of a U.S. retirement account and a Philippine bank account I had opened specifically for living expenses. My monthly budget was comfortable. A few $100s here and there felt like what you did when you cared about someone and you had more than you needed. I didn't keep track. That was my first real mistake, and I need to own it. My friend back in Ohio, a man named Chester who had been my structural engineering partner for 22 years, called me in December and asked how things were going. Chester was blunt the way only a man who has known you for 2 decades can be. I told him about Floriza. He was quiet for a moment. "You're paying for her mother's electricity," he said. "She's not asking for it." I offered. "Herb," he said, "my name is Herbert, but everyone who knows me calls me Herb. Listen to what you just told me." I told him he was being cynical. I told him he didn't understand what it was like over here, the financial realities, the way people supported their families. I told him it was different in the Philippines. He didn't argue. He just said, "Okay, buddy, you know yourself." And we moved on to other things. I should have listened to Chester. By February, the requests had grown, not all at once. Not in a way that would have set off any obvious alarm. There was a medical expense for Floriza's mother, a hospitalization that she described in tearful detail one evening, showing me photographs on her phone of an elderly woman in a hospital bed, tubes attached, expression frightened. The total she needed was $3,400. I transferred it. Then there was the matter of the property in Cebu. Floriza explained that her family had been renting a small house for years, and that the landlord was selling the building. If they didn't buy it, they would be evicted. She wasn't asking me to buy the property, she was careful to say. She just needed a loan, $22,000. She would pay it back. She had a plan. I did not ask to see the plan. I did not consult anyone. I went to the bank and I made the transfer. When I look back now, I understand that each of these moments had its own emotional logic that made refusing feel cruel rather than sensible. The sick mother, the threatened family home, the struggling child. Each story was designed, and I use that word carefully because I still don't know with absolute certainty how much of it was calculated to reach exactly the parts of me that were softest. My guilt about my own comfortable savings, my need to feel useful, protective, needed. My longing to be, in the eyes of someone I loved, a good man. In March, something else happened. Her nephew Bong arrived. He was 26, slight and quiet-spoken, with a quick smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Floriza introduced him as a young man trying to get himself established, hoping to find work in Manila. He stayed in the spare bedroom for what was supposed to be 2 weeks. By the end of April, he was still there. He ate at my table. He watched my television. He borrowed my truck twice, returning it without explanation. I didn't like him being in my house, but every time I raised it gently with Floriza, she would grow distant in a way that frightened me. A coldness would come into her face. She would be polite, always polite, but the warmth would drain out, and I would be left sitting with the terrible awareness that her warmth was no longer something I could take for granted. It had become something I had to maintain, something contingent. That was when I understood, on some level I was still refusing to look at directly, that the power in our relationship had quietly, completely reversed. By May, I had transferred a total of $67,000 since the relationship changed. I know that figure now because I went back through my bank records months later and added it up. At the time, I had no clear picture of the running total. The amounts had been spread across 6 months, each one individually justifiable, emotionally framed, accompanied by gratitude and warmth that made the transaction feel like love rather than what it was. In June, Floriza told me she had found an investment opportunity. A friend of hers had a brother. She referred to him as someone with connections in Manila, who was involved in a property development near Batangas. A modest residential project, mostly funded, just needed a final injection of capital to proceed to construction. The return she described was impressive. She showed me a document. It looked professional. Letterhead, figures, photographs of a piece of land. She said she wanted to invest her own savings, $8,000, and that she was sharing the information with me because she thought I should know about it. She did not ask me directly. She never asked me directly. That was the thing I didn't fully understand until it was over. She created situations where I offered. She was always grateful, always soft about it, always making me feel like the decision came from my own generosity rather than from pressure. I put $95,000 into that investment. There was no construction project. The money was gone within 3 months. When I confronted her about the investment in September, by which point it was clear that no returns were coming, and the contact number she had given me for the developer was disconnected, she cried. Real tears. She told me she had been deceived too, that her $8,000 was also gone, that she was devastated, humiliated, that she had trusted the wrong person, and she was so sorry, so terribly sorry for bringing it to me. She held my hands across the kitchen table and wept, and I held her, and I told her it was going to be okay. I told her it was going to be okay. I was sitting in that house with my retirement savings hemorrhaging from every seam, and I was comforting her. My daughter Patricia called me that same week. I don't know how she knew something was wrong. Maybe it was my voice. Maybe it was some parental alarm only children and parents can hear across a distance. But she asked me directly if everything was all right. I told her yes. Fine. She paused. Dad, you can tell me if it's not. I said I was fine. I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Saying it out loud would make it real. The breaking point came in October, almost exactly 1 year after I had first told Floriza how I felt. She came to me with a new request. Her daughter Blessy, she said, needed surgery. A procedure for a condition she described as serious. A problem with her appendix that the local hospital couldn't handle properly. She needed to be transferred to a better facility in Manila. The estimated cost was $38,000. I sat with that number for a long time. And then, very quietly, something in me that had been bending for a year without breaking finally broke. I didn't say no immediately. I'm not proud of that. I told her I needed a few days to think. She nodded, her expression careful, and went to prepare dinner. I called Chester that night. I told him everything, from the beginning, all of it. The electricity bill, the property loan, the nephew, the investment, the total. His end of the line was very quiet for a long time. Herb, he said finally, you need to talk to someone over there, a lawyer, a financial advisor, someone who isn't connected to her. He gave me the name of a contact, a retired American named Phil who had been living in the Philippines for over a decade and had experience helping other expats navigate exactly these kinds of situations. I called Phil the next morning. Phil met me at a coffee shop in Tagaytay. He was somewhere in his late 60s, lean and matter-of-fact in the way of a man who had seen enough to stop being surprised. He listened to me lay out everything. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he put down his cup. The investment scheme, he said. That's the biggest one. The others, the family money, the property loan, those are common patterns. This one is more serious. That's not a gray area. That's fraud. He helped me understand what I was actually looking at. The property in Cebu that I had loaned $22,000 to purchase, there was no record of any such transaction in Floriza's family name. The money I had sent to the investment contact had gone into a personal account. Phil had a local attorney, a woman named Addie, Lucinda, who handled expat financial disputes, and within a week she had begun reviewing what documentation I had. What Addie, Lucinda found over the following weeks was devastating and not entirely surprising. The loan for the Cebu property had been sent to an account that was registered in Bong's name. There was no record of any family property purchase. The investment opportunity had been entirely fabricated. The document Floriza had showed me was a template downloaded from the internet and modified. The developer's name was a shell. Bong was involved. A man Floriza introduced as her cousin Arjun, who I had met twice at Sunday dinners, and who I had believed was simply a family member passing through, had been the one to set up the investment account. I was not the first man they had done this to. Addie. Lucinda had information about at least 2 other foreign retirees who had experienced nearly identical patterns. I confronted Floriza on a Wednesday evening. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say. I wanted to be calm. I wanted to give her the chance to explain. Part of me, the part that is most ashamed of itself now, still hoped she would tell me something that made it untrue. She did not deny much of it. She sat across from me with her hands folded in her lap, and she was very still. "I care about you," she said. "That was real." "Was it?" I asked. She looked at the table. "I needed to protect my family. You used me to do it." She didn't answer. After a long silence, she said, "You had enough. You have more than enough. I didn't think it would hurt you." That was when I understood, finally and completely, that whatever she had felt for me had always been filtered through calculation. Maybe not from the very beginning, but enough. Enough that the two things, her feeling for me and her plan for my money, had never been as separate as I had needed them to be. She left the house that night. Bong was gone the next morning without a word. I sat on the porch in the dark, and I listened to the frogs in the garden, and the distant sound of someone's television from the neighboring house, and I tried to understand how I had arrived at this particular Wednesday night in my life. The legal process that followed was long and expensive and produced results I will describe simply as partial. Addie. Lucinda was effective within the limits of what was provable. Some of the transferred funds were traceable. A complaint was filed. Bong faced charges. Arjun disappeared. Floriza cooperated minimally, and ultimately, the legal system moved at its own pace in its own direction. I recovered somewhere in the range of $31,000. I lost the rest. The retirement account I had arrived with was now at approximately $178,000. From $480,000 to $178,000 in under 2 years. And there was another problem, the house. I had purchased the house outright using a structure that Rayner, the broker, had assured me was legal and sound. But what I hadn't understood at the time, what nobody had been clear enough with me about, was that certain aspects of the title arrangement, which had involved Floriza as a co-signatory because I as a foreign national had specific land ownership restrictions, left me exposed in ways I was only now beginning to understand. The legal complications around the title, combined with the associated bank debts that had accumulated during the investment fallout, meant that the house was effectively at risk. By November, there was a foreclosure notice on the door. I want to stop for a moment here, because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, how does a man with an engineering degree, a man who spent 40 years solving structural problems for a living, end up here? How does someone who built bridges not see that the ground was moving under his own feet? I've asked myself that every day. The answer is that loneliness is its own kind of blindness, not stupidity, not weakness. A specific kind of blindness that comes when you want something to be true badly enough. When I was working, when my wife was alive, when my daughter and I were close, I had anchors, things that kept me from drifting. And then the anchors were gone, one by one, over years, and I came here looking for something to hold on to. And Floriza understood that. Maybe not consciously, not all of it, but she understood which parts of me were open, and she walked through. I don't say that to excuse her. What she did was wrong. It was deliberate, and it cost me my retirement, and my security, and my sense of my own judgment. I say it to be honest about my part in it, because the story isn't interesting or useful if I pretend I was simply a helpless victim. I made choices. Every step of the way I made choices. I chose not to track the money. I chose not to listen to Chester the first time. I chose to stay in denial about what Bong was doing in my house. I chose not to call my daughter. Those choices cost me as surely as Floriza's deceptions did. Patricia came to see me in December. She flew in from Columbus with a face full of controlled worry that looked exactly like her mother's face had looked in difficult moments. And I was so glad to see her that I cried in the airport, which I have not done in public in probably 30 years. She didn't say I told you so. She didn't say anything like that. She sat with me on the porch and she looked out at the volcano and she held my hand and she said, "What do you need, Dad?" "I need to figure out what's left," I said. "Then we'll figure that out together," she said. There's a moment in a man's life, if he's lucky, when his child stops being the person he's supposed to protect and becomes, quietly, the person protecting him. Patricia became that person for me in December, and I did not deserve it as much as she gave it, but she gave it anyway. And that is the most valuable thing I have left. We are working through the legal and financial situation together now. The house will be sold. The for sale sign went up 3 weeks ago. a Filipino broker's sign in red and white that I look at from the porch every morning when I bring my coffee out. Rainer, the same cheerful broker who apologized for the rain on the day I bought the place, is handling the sale. He doesn't apologize for anything now. He's just professional. He probably sees more of this than he lets on. The koi pond has gone murky. I haven't kept up with it since everything fell apart. The plants on the porch are dying. I need to water them, but I can't always manage it with the hip and the energy that seems to have seeped out of me over the past year. One of the neighbors, an elderly man named Celestino who shuffles past every morning with a cane, stops sometimes and nods at me. We don't speak much. His English is limited and my Filipino is non-existent, but there's something in those nods that I appreciate. The recognition of two old men, both of us at this particular point in our lives, both of us still here. I'm not as angry as you might expect I was, for a while. The anger was loud and hot, and then it burned itself out, and what was underneath it was quieter and more honest. I'm sad, I'm embarrassed. I'm lonely in a different way than I was lonely before, a more clear-eyed kind, without the illusions. And I'm tired in a way that has less to do with the hip, and more to do with the effort of having believed so hard in something that was only partly real. Chester called last week. He didn't say anything unkind. He just asked if I needed anything. I told him I was okay. He said, "You know, whenever you're ready to come home, my couch is yours." I laughed. First real laugh in weeks. Chester has one of those big leather sectionals that takes up his entire living room, and he's been offering it to people as a couch for 20 years. I told him I'd keep it in mind. I've been thinking about what I'd say if I could sit across from a man who was where I was when I first arrived here. Standing on the porch looking out at the volcano with his savings intact and his heart open, and his need enormous and his judgment compromised by everything he'd lost. What would I tell him? I'd tell him, your loneliness is real, and it deserves to be addressed, but loneliness is not a good navigator. Get a lawyer before you get a companion. Open a separate account for anything that enters a personal dynamic, and set a monthly limit before the relationship starts, not after it has already softened your reasoning. Tell your children what you're doing. Let someone who loves you know the details. Not because you need their permission, but because you need an anchor. And don't let the warmth of someone's attention convince you that attention and honesty are the same thing. They're not. A con feel like a con. It feels like being seen. I am still here in Tagaytay for now. The sale will take a few months. In the meantime, I sit on this porch in the mornings with my coffee, and I watch the mist roll in over the volcano, and I try to hold both things at once. The beauty of this place, which is still real, and the wreckage of what happened here, which is also real, without letting either one crowd out the other. I came here looking for something. I found several things, some of them terrible, and some of them worth more than what they cost me. I found out that my daughter still loves me. I found out that Chester is the best friend I have ever had. I found out that I am capable of both greater self-deception and greater resilience than I had understood before. I found out that a man at 70 can still be changed by what happens to him. Whether you call that growth or just damage with better lighting, I leave to you. The rocking chair next to mine on the porch is empty. It has been empty since October. I have thought more than once about moving it, but I haven't. I don't know if I'm leaving it there because I'm not ready, or because I'm stubborn, or because some mornings the mist is so thick and so quiet that the empty chair almost feels like company. When Patricia comes back in January to help me pack, I'll have it moved then. That seems like the right time. Until then, I'm sitting here, listening to the frogs, watching the volcano disappear and reappear in the mist, working out what an old man with $178,000, a damaged hip, a cracked pair of reading glasses, and a somewhat clearer picture of himself does next. That's the story I wanted to tell you. Not because it ends well, it doesn't end the way I planned it, but because it's true, every part of it. And because if it keeps one man from sitting in a chair like mine, holding papers like the ones I'm holding, staring at a door like this one, then maybe the $480,000 bought something after all. Maybe it bought the story. And maybe, if you're listening carefully, the story is worth more than the money.